Good morning, dear ones, and welcome to Unity Church. A very special welcome to those of you who are visiting with us today. This morning we tune in from our singular rooms to join together in worship. Welcome to this time we set aside each week to help us to find and keep our balance, to think about those things that matter most, to root out racism in the world and in ourselves, and to align our lives to integrity, service, and joy. Here in the sanctuary, your worship leaders gather, taking appropriate precautions, learning as we lead to offer clarity, comfort, and inspiration in these trying times. We know that nothing can replace the face-to-face, hand-in-hand, voices raised in song, embodied worship offers. We also know that the ministry we share has never been about a building. This church is not closed. This morning we'll be lighting candles and speaking the names of some we've loved and lost to war. If you'd like to offer a name to be included in the ritual, you may send it by email to barbara@unityunitarian.org right now. And if we receive it in time, we will include it in the ritual. Many thanks to the 180 individuals who have completed Unity's annual congregational survey. The deadline to complete the survey is June 3rd, and the Board of Trustees would love to get over 400 responses. The link to the survey is on Unity's homepage and on YouTube in the details section of this live stream. Now, you may ask why, in the midst of all of this turmoil and trouble, we are taking time to ask you to fill out a survey. Well, obviously, part of that is that it makes sense for the trustees to evaluate the performance of the staff in pursuit of the ends which you have articulated. But what few people really understand is the degree to which the staff, the executive team, rely upon the survey data for planning purposes. We need to know what works and what needs work in the life of this congregation. So please, for our sake and for the sake of the trustees and their obligations, please take a few minutes and fill out the survey. Again, it's available on Unity's homepage and on YouTube in the details section of this live stream. Next Sunday, Pentecost Sunday, during a service titled Consider the Radiance, we will explore how staying put and slowing down helps us notice the beauty that surrounds us and be nourished by it. Following the service, we invite you to come together for a virtual coffee hour on Zoom. Information about how to connect to the gathering is available on Unity's homepage, and the link will be shared at the end of this service. In the coming days and weeks, we will continue to find new ways to come together for worship, for learning, for ever deeper connection, for justice, and for love. Welcome, and stay tuned.
We were slowly making our way through a museum in Ho Chi Minh City when a woman approached us hesitantly. She gently asked, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" "Of course not," we replied. She looked deeply into my eyes. "Why are you here?" she asked. We replied, "We are here because we want to know more about the impact of the war on your country. We are here to learn from the stories we encounter in museums, in the villages, in the tunnels we hope to tour." She smiled at me and said, "I wish so much that more people like you came to visit. We are so used to seeing the haunted faces of the returning veterans and their wives. We want to share our stories just as we want to hear yours." I then told her that we had protested the war, but also understood that war injures everyone, no matter which side you are on. We nodded to each other and smiled broadly. She wished us well on the rest of our trip, and we nodded our goodbyes. Throughout the years, as we have toured memorials in Southeast Asia, I felt as I do when we visit Normandy or the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. As my hands slide over the letters of a life lost, I wonder about that life, the stories we'll never know, the suffering of families left behind, the sacrifices and suffering of our dead, and the sacrifices and suffering of our enemies. Come, let us worship together.
And will you remain standing in body or in spirit and read with me in unison the gates of freedom? Though our knowledge is incomplete, our truth partial, and our love imperfect, We believe that new light is ever waiting to break through individual hearts and minds to enlighten our way, that there is mutual strength in willing cooperation, and that the bonds of love keep open the gates of freedom. Please be seated, and let us be together for a moment of silence as we arrive completely into this place and into this time for worship.
Each time we gather for worship, we set aside a moment to expand the caring ministry of this congregation. Together we recognize the cycle of life and death, the circle of love, compassion, and witness that is at the center of this and of every sacred community. We stand at the side of parents, teachers, and all those whose primary spiritual practice is caring for children, with those who live with grief or chronic pain, with illnesses seen and unseen, with mental disability or addiction. We pray for our neighbors in prison, for those who care for family members in ill health, and those who are struggling to stay afloat in the midst of poverty. Our lives are blessed by those who knowingly and with curiosity and courage face their final days, and by those who rise above the heartbreak to challenge oppression in all of its forms. We pray for those in harm's way, for the wisdom and strength of the leaders of the world, and for the people of this courageous congregation, as together we live into our longing to embody and help to build the beloved community. And will you pray with me for all these we now name? Ellen and Ken Green and family grieve the death of Doug Martin Casper, a brilliant, caring, and funny man who helped many to recover from drug addiction and abuse, but was unable to make it through the COVID-19 isolation on his own. We hold Michelle Sheary as she and other members of her family grieve the loss of her mother, Dixie Ty. We all know that losing someone in the midst of the pandemic can be especially challenging. So we also hold Michelle's father, Cliff Ty, as well, as along with her children and her husband, Marcus. We send our healing thoughts and prayers to Ellen Green's mother, Mary Novid Blackman, who has been hospitalized after a fall. Mary was a WAC in World War II and met Ellen's father, William Blackman, while they both served in the war. We hold all the people whose lives have been adversely affected by the fire in the Wilder Park Towers this past week. A number of Unity members and friends live there, some who have taken in fellow apartment mates to shelter them as their apartments are cleaned and repaired. We continue to hold all those around the world who are on the front lines serving others in the face of the pandemic. And we remember all those who served in the name of higher values as they prayed for peace. And now we stand in compassionate solidarity with our neighbors here at home and all around the world. May they and may we be an instruments of a just and lasting peace. I now invite you to speak aloud or to hold in the silent sanctuary of your hearts the names of those you would like to lift today in worship. And let us pray. Spirit of life, Spirit of mystery, love, and mercy, God of many names and beyond all naming, God of our being and our becoming. Every human heart is wounded in some way by war and violence, distrust and fear. May we challenge ourselves to imagine that those we are taught to see as the other, as our enemies, as those with whom we cannot build bridges, help us to see the face of the holy in those eyes across lines and thresholds of difference. May we find ways to cross over, to reach toward, knowing ourselves this is sacred work. This is the work of our hearts. This is the work of the holy made real. May it be so, and amen. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in a wind, rise in the sea. Moving land, giving life a shade of justice, roots falling close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Memorial Day this year, for many of us, will be more quiet, more still. Not as many road trips, not as many picnics at the beach or the park, not as many parades. The pandemic marks yet another holiday. But maybe it will help us to recenter, to refocus on the original purpose of Memorial Day, to remember those who have given their lives to wars fought by our nation. Like other aspects of our lives, maybe it will help us to reflect on what matters most and how we can observe Memorial Day. I want to invite the children to come in a little bit closer, wherever you are, a little closer to the screen and in your living rooms, as I want to take you on a tour of war memorials, two of them in particular, at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Come a little closer. When Washington was made the capital of the United States, for nearly 200 years, there were no major war memorials on the National Mall. That great space between the U.S. Capitol building and all the way on the other end, the Lincoln Memorial. But in 1902, when the people reimagined that space as an important space and a centerpiece for Washington, D.C., the planners could imagine no more important drama in the history of our nation than the Civil War and the fight for the State of the Union. And so they framed the National Mall on one end with a Capitol building and the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial, and all the way on the other, the Lincoln Memorial. It would not be long before we had World War II, then Korea, then Vietnam, all memorialized in reverse order. And right now, there are even more war memorials. Last counting, 5 more war memorials being planned for on or near the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The U.S. Commission of Fine Arts is the federal agency that reviews the proposals, the designs, everything from the U.S. coin to medals to government buildings to war memorials in Washington, D.C. And 2 summers ago, in June 2018, the commission met to vote to approve the plans for the site where they were going to memorialize veterans of the Gulf War. As the conversations and the debates of this controversial memorial continued, people were being convinced, and most of them had come around to voting in favor of placing the Gulf War Memorial near the Lincoln Memorial and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. But there was one dissenting voice. Vice Chair Dr. Elizabeth Meyer, a professor at the University of Virginia. She spoke quietly, but chose her words carefully. Coming from a family of career military officers, she knew that a vote not against having a memorial, but a vote against where they should have that memorial could be mistaken as a disrespect for veterans. So she spoke carefully. I'm concerned at the growing number of war memorials in the National Mall, she said. The mall symbolizes that public space which is our national identity. I'm concerned as the number of war memorials grow, there will be yet another war resulting in yet another war memorial. Where does the line get drawn when the National Mall essentially becomes a cemetery, leaving no space for Americans to reimagine our identity as a people? Elizabeth Meyer was asking a deep and difficult question. And so I decided this past week to take Google's virtual tour of war memorials in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Imagine with me beginning at one end of the National Mall with the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial that honors the Civil War general and the 18th President of the United States of America. You have to really look up high to see General Grant riding way up there above a mighty horse, on a pedestal and below, surrounded by soldiers, his troops, and even 2 strong lions at the pedestal. Everything is elevated, and it's hard to miss the message of power. It basically says our purpose was noble, our forces were powerful, and we, the Union, won. That's how many of us like to remember ourselves. We want our war memorials to reassure us, to comfort us, rather than to disturb or ask challenging questions of us. But Google's virtual tour, come along with me, continues on. Let's walk all the way across to the other end, to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. There is no general high above a horse. In fact, there is nothing that is high or elevated. In fact, a V-shaped granite stone wall is sunken into the earth, and etched on the black granite walls, more than 58,000 names of those who died in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam Memorial invites visitors to walk alongside and into the wall, to read the names, to trace the names, to touch it, and to touch the wounds and the memories that are etched not just in stone, but in our hearts. Perhaps the greatest gift of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is that it gives the visitor the ability to see our own reflections at the same time as we see the engraved names. The past and the present connecting, the dead and the living touching one another, and reflecting back to us the question asked by Dr. Elizabeth Meyer, the question of who we are and what matters most to us as a people. And that we must always remember the cost of human lives at the heart of these most challenging moral questions we are asking even today. So we remember. So we remember. Amen.
Friends, before I ask the offering, I want to express our deep connection and gratitude to the Muslim community around the world who this weekend are ending the month of Ramadan with the feast of Eid. The month of Ramadan seems to me to be a reflection or a ritual tradition that informs these days when we're living within the pandemic. Just as the dawn to dusk fast calls for self-reflection and for a deepening sense of our interdependence, we're living at a time when, if we see clearly, and if we listen well, and if we linger in the midst of it, we too will learn something transformative about our own interdependence and our connections one to another. Friends, though our ministry now is largely online, the church's financial obligations do continue. Your support of the church is an expression of the promises we make to each other and to the world. We know that some of you have had your hours reduced and that some of you have been furloughed or have even lost your jobs. Please let us know if you're facing financial difficulty. We are here to help, but don't let fear undermine your commitment to the ministry we share. Please do your best to be generous with the church so that the church can continue to be generous with the many community partners our Sunday offerings support and continue to support our programs and our staff. Today, the larger portion of our offering will go to further the work of Veterans for Peace. Growing out of the trauma and revelations of the war in Vietnam, Veterans for Peace works to increase public awareness of the costs of war and provides an organizing base that seeks justice for veterans and victims of war while working to abolish warfare as an instrument of national policy. During the offering, please visit Unity's webpage and follow the link in the Sunday service section to make your donation. You can also use the Give function located in our Shelby Next membership app and online database, or mail a check to the church. Thank you in advance for your generosity, both of spirit and of money.
The end and the beginning. After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody rags. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic it's not, and it takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. We'll need the bridges back and a new railway station. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with an unsevered head. But already there are those nearby starting to mill about who will find it dull. From out of the bushes, sometimes someone still unearths rusted out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little, and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing. In the grass that has overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, a blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds.
He sat opposite me in the circle, a beloved older colleague for whom I have great respect. He was in a rotten mood. He admitted he was sick to death of being home by himself, yelling at the mindless hyperbole of the television news. Familiar? His joy at being out with colleagues was almost overshadowed by his conviction that the state of the world was spiraling down from bad to worse. And another thing, he said in the midst of his tirade, have you read the Unitarian Universalist World? The article on military chaplaincy made me absolutely ill. The comment brought me up short. I am thrilled to see Unitarian Universalist ministers opting to serve as military chaplains. Just as our inclusive, life-affirming theology equips us well to serve in hospitals and prisons, our practiced ability to respect the many ways people speak of their faith while affirming the common experience of the holy that is at the heart of every faith makes us especially well-suited for military chaplaincy. Though the number of Unitarian Universalists serving in the armed forces as chaplains remains small, I'm both deeply supportive and very proud of our progress. I stated my position and asked my colleague to further explain his. I've seen what happens, he said. As soon as you enter the chain of command, you lose your soul. There is simply no way to be involved and not be in complicity with evil. Like an old Hebrew prophet, he sat upright in his chair, crying out, "Beware! Unclean! Do not be taken in." I argued with him. We need to be, I said, wherever people struggle to live out their values. We can't relinquish the armed forces to the control of right-wing so-called patriots. Despite its many shortcomings, the military has been among the most powerful influences in the fight for racial equity and justice. It is an incredibly diverse community made up largely of people who signed up to serve. We need to respect their motives. We need to build bridges. We need to be there. We need to risk contamination in the interest of a more inclusive, more responsive world. You may think you're strong enough to take that risk, he said, but I'm not, and I don't know anyone who actually is. I deeply respect his right to be wrong. I take his warnings seriously. But he and I approach the question of complicity in entirely different ways. While he shouts out, "Unclean, stand clear," I have to say, "Engage, come closer." The only way I know to ease the violence, who can speak of ending it, is to make friends with those whose hands are on the rifle, and yes, to share both their struggle and their responsibility. I've found over the years that when I try to maintain some semblance of purity or even safety by distancing myself from people whose behavior or ideology offends or frightens me, it makes me less effective, not more, in bringing my values to bear. The distance may make me feel self-righteous, but it also keeps me ignorant of the values and motives of other people. Each year I approach Memorial Day with deep ambivalence. I don't want to glorify war. I would rather, as Lao Tzu advises, conduct my victory like a funeral. But despite my lifelong commitment to peacemaking, and to some degree because of it, I want very much for us to honor those who have, at risk of life and limb, and even of their sanity, stepped up when duty called and helped defend the nation. I am no gung-ho, love-it-or-leave-it patriot. No true patriot is. I am, as the brilliant bumper sticker on a dear friend's car proclaims, already against the next war. A person who is spiritually mature is a person able to live with ambiguity, able, in this case, to live with the dual reality that war is hell and that we are called and compelled to remember and to love our neighbors who are forced to fight and sometimes to die in our interest and in our name. And so we do remember. In a few minutes, we will read responsively Archibald MacLeish's The Young Dead Soldiers, in which he gives voice to what some soldiers may well be thinking as they lie dying in the field. We leave you our deaths. Give them their meaning. We were young, they say. We have died. Remember us. But before we touch the depth of grief and gratitude the ritual intends, I want to take a moment to speak about moral injury. The term was first used by Marine veteran and philosopher Camille Mac Bika in his war journals from Vietnam. In their 2012 Beacon Press book, Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, Rita Nakashima Brock and Gabriella Latini shed light on both the personal and collective damage done to the very fabric of human community when men and women are forced to violate their core moral beliefs. They write, "Moral injury is the result of reflections on memories of war or other extreme traumatic conditions. It comes from having transgressed one's basic moral identity and violated core beliefs. The tired truism, war is hell, is also true of its aftermath, but the aftermath can be endless. War has a goal and tours of duty that end. Its torments are intense and devastating, but they are not perpetual. As memory and reflection deepen, negative self-judgments can torment a soul for a lifetime. When veterans return to our communities after war, we owe it to them and to ourselves to do our best to support their recovery. To do so, however, we must be willing to engage the same intense moral questions that veterans undertake about our own responsibility as a society for having sent them to war. This book is an invitation to accept that transformative process." End quote. The endless vigilance called for by the construct of the so-called war on terrorism undermines the rest required for recovery from moral injury. There is no more at ease, either for our troops or for ourselves. The moral injury movement reframes the task of making and keeping the peace in the context of recovery. It's welcome news that the Lilly Foundation is providing generous support to help establish centers for soul repair that can help coordinate the therapeutic support, creative conversations, and artistic endeavors all of us need, whether we know it or not. The first such center, established by Rita Nakashima Brock, was founded in 2012 at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. The Soul Repair Center supports faith communities across denominations to provide counsel and support for those working to recover from the devastating impacts of moral injury. In recent years, both the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Shea Center, begun by the Volunteers of America, have also taken up this vital work. As the great Nobel Prize-winning poet Wisława Szymborska reminds us, after every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with an unsevered head. Some years ago, while on sabbatical, we spent a few days on Crete. One day we went walking on the beach with our friend and colleague Bob Fulgham. At the time, he was collecting stories in anticipation of writing a narrative history of the island. One day he recalled, "I was wandering through the German cemetery when I saw an old Cretan widow dressed all in black. She was sweeping the grave of a young, dead German soldier. In my broken Greek, I asked her how, given the horrors of the German occupation, she could bring herself to honor their dead in this way. She looked up at me, her ancient eyes welled up, and then she said, 'My son went off to fight the Germans. He's buried in a field there. I sweep as a prayer that the mother of the boy that's buried here, or some other grieving mother, sometimes sweeps the grave of my son.' In the eyes of God, there are no other people's children." In closing, more from Soul Repair. Few major social institutions teach moral integrity, courage, personal discipline, humility, a sense of purpose and responsibility, and commitment to the lives of others better than the armed forces. And none works so thoroughly to compromise, deny, dismantle, and destroy the very values that it teaches. This is the paradox of war. The human beings we know and care about volunteer for military service. We send them off to war, and they return morally injured. They still belong to us. They are still the people we love, and we cannot build a different humanity or a different world without facing that fierce angel of moral injury together. Together, friends. Together, we remember. Together, we give meaning to their lives. May it be so, and amen.
And will you join with us in the responsive reading? The young dead soldiers do not speak.
Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They have a silence that speaks for them at night and when the clock counts.
They say, "We were young, we have died, remember us." They say, "We have done what we could, but until it is finished, it is not done."
They say, "We have given our lives, but until it is finished, no one can know what our lives gave." They say, "Our deaths are not ours, they are yours. They will mean what you make them."
They say, "Whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope, or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this." They say, "We leave you our deaths. Give them their meaning."
We were young, they say. We have died.
Remember us. and now we seek to honor those who have served. Memorializing two men who served in World War II, Major Kenneth Green, father of Ken Green, 12th Armored Division, who was killed in action January 17, 1945 in France near Strasbourg, and Russell Goddard, stepdad of Ken, who landed during the second hour of D-Day on Utah Beach, then was in continuous combat for the next 6 months with the 4th Infantry Division. Russell came back and died in 2012 after a long life as husband and father of 3.
Tony Johnson served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Bolivia from 1966 to 69, was drafted immediately upon his return home, and died in Vietnam. He was loved and admired by those who served with him in Bolivia and whom he served, an example of the good that peaceful people can do in the world.
We remember Wilhelm Juncker, a young German soldier who died at the Russian front on May 7th of 1944.
And we speak the name of Roman R. Zorro, who served in the Coast Guard in the Second World War, survived many losses and hardships with sheer will, persistence, stubbornness, and faith. A self-made and selfless man. Dad, you're my hero.
At the age of 19, John Patrick Eves served as a combat medic in the 1st Cavalry Division, 173rd Airborne Brigade, 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry B Company, 75th Ranger Company. John was recognized for heroism in combat, awarded 2 Bronze Star Medals for valor and a Purple Heart. He was later diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia 8 years ago due to his exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam. He lost his battle to that illness on November 19th, 2018 at the age of 68.
U.S. Navy Commander Jason Woodbury served for 9 years of active duty in the United States Navy, including time on the USS Michigan, the largest nuclear submarine in the United States fleet. He continued his service in the Naval Reserves and in his dream job as a firefighter with the St. Paul Fire Department. He was a devoted and beloved son, husband, father, brother, and Vikings fan.
We remember Russian pilot Vladimir Sherov, killed in action June 27, 1944. He was one of 27 million Russians, both soldiers and civilians, who lost their lives in World War II.
Honoring Jim Herring, who served as first lieutenant in the United States Army from 1965 to 68. He survived the horrors of active duty in Vietnam and returned home determined to enlist himself in new directions, honoring a respect for life and death and the power of love. In the decades since, Jim foster parented 40 children.
And continues to serve as a hospice volunteer and chaplain, accompanying countless strangers and loved ones alike as they cross death's threshold. 2 brothers sent off to Truman's War, technically a police action, but when my dad accompanied my uncle's flag-draped coffin home on the train, they were coming home from a war. When my dad drove supplies to the front lines, the Russian-provided artillery rained on his truck just like any other war. And when he came home, my dad's war, the war about which his brother shouldn't have died, was just beginning. Today I remember my dad, George Burkholz, and his brother, Melvin.
We recall the name of Klaus von Stauffenberg, a German officer of rank who so loved his country that he risked and lost his life in an attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler.
Vietnam veteran Barry Reich has lost 5 good veterans for peace this past year. Larry Sissy Goodwin from Cowboy Country, Wyoming, a Vietnam vet and peace activist who also happened to be a cross-dresser. He took a lot of abuse for being who he was, but he maintained his dignity and used this to help others who were like him not to feel alone.
Thomas Bradley and Barry Binks, both veterans who transformed their military experience into useful service as people for peace.
Bruce Byers chose a different path in military service and fled to Canada during the Vietnam War to avoid participating in a war he did not believe in. He lived in exile for many years before returning to the U.S. and facing charges.
Joe Schwartz, World War II Navy veteran whose life was saved by his recovery from alcoholism. We were AA friends for many, many years.
We light a candle for Vietnamese author Bao Ninh, one of 10 survivors of the 500-member North Vietnamese Glorious 27th Youth Brigade. His book, The Sorrow of War, takes us to the very heart of darkness. He writes, "The sorrow of war inside a soldier's heart was in a strange way similar to the sorrow of love. It was a kind of nostalgia, like the immense sadness of a whirl at dusk. It was a sadness, a missing, a pain, which could send one soaring back into the past."
Michael Orange, who fought in Vietnam and is a Vietnam veteran for peace, wants us to remember his close friends, Chris and Leo, who survived combat with him in Vietnam, but not the psychological scars and moral injury from that war. This candle is for them and the 22 veterans who today, like every average day for too many years, will commit suicide.
I'm remembering all the female spies in World War I and World War II, many of whom were trilingual, but being women, no one imagined that they might be trilingual. They were very effective hotel maids and waitresses and listened to every word they heard.
We remember Ward Freeman.
We remember Kelly Hintz, Laura Lee's cousin.
Kelly's father, Don Hintz.
We remember Lieutenant Raymond P. Wiedemeyer, missing in action in the Pacific in World War II.
And we speak the name of Charlie Caswell's great-grandfather, Captain James B. Perry, who was killed on his way home to visit his pregnant wife.
And we light a candle for Captain Duncan Baird.
And will you pray with me? Holy One, aware as we are of their sacrifice, we commit ourselves again, not only to remember, not only to shape our communities so that moral injury can be named and healed, but to follow the example of many who we have named today in transforming trauma into transforming service, that the wounds of war may come in time to be the blessings of peace. May it be so, and amen.
Amen.
Let us then live with the knowledge and the prayer that right makes might, and to the end, let us do our duty as we understand it. May that duty be for love. May it be so, and amen.